Why won't you let me leave? I accidentally confessed to my billionaire CEO. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Before we dive into today's emotional journey of two women whose lives become forever intertwined through an unexpected confession, I have one small request. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with romance, resilience, healing, and unforgettable moments, please take a second to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. It's completely free, it only takes a moment, and your support allows us to continue creating powerful stories about love, second chances, and the courage to follow your heart. We truly appreciate every single one of you. And before the story begins, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Leave the name of your city or country in the comments below so we can say hello to our amazing community around the world. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's return to our story and the unforgettable moment when one unexpected confession changed everything in Claire Bennett's life. The hardest words I have ever spoken were never "I love you." They were, "I quit." The resignation letter felt heavier than the leather folder I carried through the silent executive floor, even though it was only a single sheet of paper. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a gray October sky, the city moving with its usual confidence while I stood completely still. 3 years earlier, I would have given anything just to work inside Sterling Global, the most admired consulting empire in the country. Now all I wanted was the courage to walk away before my heart betrayed me again. My name is Claire Bennett, I am 38 years old, and I have spent the last 4 years building strategies that helped billion-dollar companies survive impossible situations. People described me as calm under pressure, analytical, impossible to surprise. They had no idea that every morning, the most difficult part of my day was stepping into the same elevator as the woman who unknowingly occupied every quiet corner of my thoughts. Evelyn Sterling was the kind of leader business magazines called legendary. Employees called her demanding. Investors called her brilliant. I simply called her impossible to forget. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. When she entered a room, conversations naturally softened because everyone wanted to hear what she would say next. She noticed details other people ignored, remembered names months after brief introductions, and somehow expected excellence without making you feel small. 4 years ago, I had arrived at this company carrying nothing but a cardboard box, a fresh divorce, and the quiet fear that maybe my best years had already disappeared. While others saw a woman rebuilding her career, Evelyn saw potential I had stopped believing existed. She challenged every presentation I created, questioned every assumption I made, and refused to accept work that was merely good enough. At first I thought she disliked me. Eventually I realized something far more dangerous. She believed in me more than I believed in myself. That realization changed everything. Respect slowly became admiration. Admiration quietly became affection. Affection transformed into something I spent 2 years pretending did not exist. I never crossed a line. I never hinted at my feelings. I never allowed myself fantasies that belonged only in novels instead of conference rooms. She was my CEO. I was her employee. Some distances existed for a reason, and I reminded myself of that every single morning. But hearts are stubborn things. They rarely listen to logic, especially after they have spent years healing from old wounds. So I made the only decision that seemed fair to both of us. I accepted a leadership offer from another firm across the country. A new city. A new beginning. A chance to finally breathe without measuring every heartbeat. My resignation rested inside the folder as I stopped outside Evelyn's office. Through the glass wall, I could see her standing alone, watching the skyline with her hands folded behind her back, completely unaware that in less than 10 minutes, both of our lives were about to change forever. The sight of Evelyn standing by the window pulled me backward through time before I could knock on her door. 4 years earlier, I had walked into Sterling Global wearing a navy suit that no longer fit quite right because I had lost almost 20 pounds during my divorce. I remember staring at the polished marble lobby, wondering whether everyone could somehow see the exhaustion behind my professional smile. My confidence had disappeared long before my marriage officially ended. Months of quiet disappointment had convinced me that I was ordinary, replaceable, and already falling behind while everyone else seemed to move forward. I almost turned around before checking in with reception. If I had, my life would have followed a completely different path. My first meeting with Evelyn Sterling lasted less than 15 minutes, but I remembered every second of it. She entered the conference room carrying only a tablet and a cup of black coffee. No dramatic introduction. No attempt to impress anyone. She simply sat across from me, studied my resume for a few silent moments, then looked directly into my eyes. Instead of asking where I saw myself in 5 years, she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. She said, "What is one talent you have stopped trusting?" I hesitated longer than I should have. Finally, I admitted that I used to believe I could solve difficult problems, but somewhere along the way I had started doubting every decision I made. She nodded once, as though my answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she smiled, just enough to soften the seriousness in her expression. She said, "Good. Skills can be taught. Honesty cannot." I was hired 2 days later. Working for Evelyn was nothing like the stories people whispered in the cafeteria. Yes, she expected excellence. Yes, she challenged every report, every forecast, every recommendation. But she criticized ideas without ever attacking people. Whenever I made a mistake, she never asked who was responsible. She asked what we had learned. Whenever I succeeded, she made certain the entire team received credit instead of allowing the spotlight to remain on herself. Slowly, the fear that had followed me into Sterling Global began to disappear. I found myself speaking with confidence during board meetings, leading negotiations with clients twice my size, and mentoring younger analysts who reminded me of the frightened woman I used to be. One afternoon, after I successfully rescued a multi-million-dollar client presentation that had nearly collapsed, Evelyn stopped beside my desk as everyone else left for lunch. She placed a handwritten note next to my keyboard before walking away without saying a word. It contained only one sentence. "Never underestimate the strength you have already survived." I folded that note and carried it in my wallet every single day afterward. She probably forgot writing it within a week. I never did. That simple act of kindness became the quiet foundation beneath my rebuilding life. Somewhere between impossible deadlines, late evening strategy sessions, and countless victories we celebrated with nothing more than a respectful handshake and sincere gratitude, I stopped seeing Sterling Global as the place where my career had recovered. It became the place where my heart quietly chose someone I could never allow myself to pursue. I kept telling myself that admiration could be controlled if I was disciplined enough, but feelings have a quiet way of growing in the spaces where we believe nothing can survive. It was never one dramatic moment that changed me. It was hundreds of ordinary moments that slowly became unforgettable. Every Monday morning, Evelyn arrived before anyone else. The lights in her office would already be glowing while the rest of Manhattan was still waking up. She greeted the security staff by name, remembered whose daughter had just started college, and always thanked the maintenance crew before stepping into the elevator. None of those moments ever appeared in business magazines, yet they revealed more about her character than any interview ever could. Watching her lead taught me that real authority was never about demanding respect. It was about earning it one quiet decision at a time. That lesson stayed with me long after our meetings ended. As the years passed, our professional relationship became built on complete trust. When negotiations became difficult, she asked for my opinion before anyone else's. When clients questioned our strategy, she looked toward me with complete confidence, silently inviting me to speak. Every time she did, I felt stronger than the woman who had first walked through Sterling Global's doors carrying nothing except self-doubt. She had rebuilt my confidence without ever promising that she would. Ironically, that was exactly why I knew I had to leave. I began noticing the small changes inside myself that no promotion could explain. I found excuses to arrive a few minutes early whenever I knew we had executive meetings. I remembered details from conversations that everyone else had forgotten. If she looked tired after an overseas flight, I quietly adjusted presentation schedules so she could catch her breath before another board meeting. She never asked me to do those things. I simply wanted her days to be a little easier. Then one evening everything became painfully clear. We had just finished preparing for an investor conference that had stretched nearly 12 hours. Most of the office had emptied hours earlier, leaving only the distant hum of air conditioning and the glow of computer screens. As I gathered my notes, the city lights reflected across the windows like thousands of tiny stars. Evelyn walked beside me toward the elevator carrying the same calm expression she always wore after solving impossible problems. Just before the doors opened, she thanked me for another successful project. Then she said something so simple that it unsettled me for weeks. She smiled gently and said, "I hope wherever your career takes you one day, they realize how fortunate they are." The elevator doors closed before I could answer. Those words echoed inside me all night because they carried an assumption I had never considered. One day I would leave. She expected it. She wanted me to keep growing, even if that growth happened somewhere else. Instead of comforting me, the realization broke something open inside my heart. I understood then that I had crossed a line I could never admit aloud. I was no longer staying because Sterling Global was the best place to build my future. I was staying because every ordinary day with Evelyn had quietly become the happiest part of my life. The next morning I accepted a confidential call from another company offering me the position of Chief Strategy Officer in Seattle. It was everything I had worked toward for years. Better compensation. Greater responsibility. Complete independence. I accepted the offer before I could change my mind because I knew that if I stayed any longer, leaving would eventually become impossible. My hand hovered over the polished walnut door for several long seconds before I finally knocked. "Come in," Evelyn's steady voice answered from inside, calm as always, completely unaware that every carefully built wall inside me was beginning to crumble. I stepped into her office, closing the door quietly behind me. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor, casting long shadows over framed awards and photographs from years of company milestones. Evelyn looked up from her tablet, immediately noticing the leather folder in my hands. Her eyes settled on it for only a heartbeat before returning to my face. "You look like someone carrying difficult news," she said gently. I managed a nervous smile that fooled neither of us. "I have accepted another position." The words sounded strangely distant, as though someone else had spoken them. She remained silent for several seconds, allowing the sentence to settle between us without interruption. Finally, she nodded once. "Congratulations." It was exactly the response I expected, and somehow it hurt more than disappointment would have. She asked where I was going, what the position involved, and whether it offered the opportunities one had been seeking. Every question reflected genuine interest rather than obligation. She never once asked how the decision affected Sterling Global. She only asked whether it was right for me. That quiet generosity almost destroyed my resolve. I handed her the resignation letter. She accepted it without opening the folder, then slowly walked toward the window overlooking the city. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply heavy with everything neither of us knew how to say. Finally Evelyn broke the silence. Without turning around, she asked softly, "Claire, may I ask you one honest question?" I swallowed hard. "Of course." She faced me again, her expression thoughtful rather than stern. "Why are you really leaving?" I had rehearsed this conversation for weeks. Better compensation. Greater responsibility. Career advancement. Every professional answer had been prepared in perfect detail. Yet standing there, looking into the eyes of the woman who had rebuilt my confidence piece by piece, every carefully memorized sentence disappeared. My heart was racing faster than my thoughts. I opened my mouth intending to deliver the polished explanation I had practiced countless times. Instead, another truth escaped before I could stop it. "Because staying here means falling more in love with you every single day." The room became impossibly still. I heard my own breathing before I heard anything else. The words hung in the air between us, undeniable and irreversible. My face grew warm as reality caught up with what I had just confessed. I immediately shook my head, taking one hurried step backward. I am so sorry, I whispered, my voice barely steady. You were never supposed to hear that. Please forget I said anything. That was unfair to you. I could not bear to look at her expression for more than a second. Embarrassment rushed through me with overwhelming force. Every instinct told me to escape before the silence became even more unbearable. I reached for the office door with trembling fingers, convinced I had just destroyed the most meaningful professional relationship of my life. I managed to open it before I heard Evelyn speak my name. Not loudly. Not urgently. Simply with the same calm certainty that had guided me through countless impossible moments before. Claire. I stopped walking, my hand still resting on the door handle, unable to decide whether turning around would be the bravest decision of my life or the greatest mistake. My fingers tightened around the door handle, but I could not make myself move. There was something in the way Evelyn said my name that stopped every instinct telling me to run. It was not shock. It was not anger. It was quiet sincerity. I slowly turned back toward her, expecting disappointment, perhaps even a gentle reminder about professional boundaries. Instead, I found her standing exactly where I had left her, the unopened resignation letter still resting on her desk. She looked composed, but for the first time in 4 years, I noticed something unfamiliar in her expression. Uncertainty. Evelyn Sterling always seemed to know the next move before everyone else did. Yet in that moment, she searched for the right words just as carefully as I had. She took a slow breath before speaking. Thank you for telling me the truth, she said. I know how difficult that must have been. I shook my head immediately. No. I should never have said it. You have always treated me with respect, and I repaid you by making everything awkward. She stepped a little closer, leaving several feet between us, carefully preserving the professional distance that had always existed. Claire, look at me. I reluctantly lifted my eyes. You have nothing to apologize for. Feelings are not misconduct. Actions are what define our character. Her words caught me completely by surprise. She was protecting my dignity even after my confession. That simple act somehow made the moment even more emotional. I laughed quietly, mostly to stop myself from crying. Then please accept my resignation. That is the right solution. I can leave knowing I was honest, and you never have to carry this burden again. Evelyn remained silent for several long seconds. Then she asked a question I had never expected. If I were not your chief executive officer, would you still be leaving? My heartbeat stumbled. I answered honestly because there was no longer any reason to hide. No. Not for any amount of money. She closed her eyes briefly before looking back at me. That is exactly why I cannot ask you to stay. I felt my chest tighten, but before disappointment could settle, she continued. Not because I do not value you. Quite the opposite. The responsibility I carry means every decision involving you must be unquestionably fair. If I asked you to stay after what you have just shared, neither of us could ever know whether your future here was earned through your talent or influenced by emotions. You deserve certainty. You deserve to know every success belongs entirely to you. I stared at her, realizing that even now she was putting my future ahead of her own comfort. She slowly reached for my resignation letter but still did not open it. I am not accepting this today, she said softly. Confusion crossed my face. I am also not rejecting it. I want you to take the weekend. Think about the opportunity in Seattle without guilt, without fear, and without wondering whether this conversation changes my opinion of you. It does not. You remain one of the finest leaders I have ever worked with. She paused before adding words that settled deeply into my heart. Whatever you choose, I want it to be a decision made from freedom, not from shame. For the first time since I had walked into her office, I realized the future had become far more complicated than simply leaving or staying. The resignation letter still rested unopened between us, and somehow that single sheet of paper now carried the weight of 2 hearts that refused to take the easiest path. That weekend became the longest 48 hours of my life. I walked through Central Park beneath golden autumn leaves, sat alone in neighborhood coffee shops, and even packed half the moving boxes in my apartment, yet every decision seemed to circle back to the same impossible question. Was I leaving because Seattle offered a better future, or because I believed distance was the only way to protect both of us? By Sunday evening, I still did not know the answer. On Monday morning I arrived at Sterling Global earlier than usual, expecting another difficult conversation. Instead, Evelyn invited me into her office before our executive meeting began. There was no tension in her voice, only quiet composure. She motioned toward the chair across from her desk. "Before you tell me your decision," she said, "there is something I should have told you a long time ago." I sat down without speaking. She folded her hands together, something I had only seen her do when the conversation truly mattered. "The day you joined this company, I promised myself that I would never allow personal feelings to influence your career." I frowned slightly, unsure where she was leading. She looked out the window for a brief moment before continuing. "That promise became much more difficult than I expected." My heartbeat quickened. She met my eyes with remarkable honesty. "Claire, you are not the only person who has been hiding something." Every sound outside her office seemed to disappear. She smiled faintly, though there was sadness behind it. "About 2 years ago, I realized I looked forward to meetings with you more than I should. I found myself searching for your opinion before anyone else's. I noticed when you were tired, when you skipped lunch because you were too focused, and when you smiled after solving a problem that everyone else believed was impossible. None of those observations belonged in a professional relationship, yet I could not stop making them." I stared at her in complete disbelief. She continued before I could interrupt. "Do you remember the promotion to senior strategy manager?" I nodded. "The board questioned whether you were ready. I argued in your favor for nearly an hour because your performance justified it. When they finally agreed, I almost felt too happy. That frightened me. I realized my judgment, while still supported by facts, was becoming emotionally complicated." She paused and took a slow breath. "That was the moment I created stricter boundaries. Fewer private meetings. More executives included in discussions. Greater transparency in every decision involving you. Not because I wanted distance from you, but because I refused to abuse the position I held." Tears quietly filled my eyes before I even realized it. Every moment I had interpreted as emotional distance had actually been an act of protection. She had never rejected me. She had been protecting my career, my reputation, and the integrity of every opportunity one earned. Evelyn's voice remained calm, but I could hear the emotion beneath it. "I could never ask you to stay because I love this company enough to lead it responsibly, and I respect you too much to place you in an impossible position. If there is ever a future where we stand beside one another as equals, I would welcome the chance to discover what might have been possible. But as your chief executive officer, I cannot be the reason you choose your path." In that moment, I finally understood that the greatest expression of love is not possession. Sometimes it is having the strength to protect another person's future, even when doing so quietly breaks your own heart. When I left Evelyn's office that morning, I finally understood that love and timing are not always the same thing. For the first time since joining Sterling Global, I no longer questioned whether my feelings had been real. I questioned whether I loved her enough to leave. The answer came quietly as I looked across the executive floor filled with people whose careers she had shaped with integrity. If I truly admired the woman she was, then I had to respect the principles she refused to compromise. By the end of the day, I signed the final resignation papers. Evelyn accepted them with the same calm grace she had shown from the beginning. There were no dramatic promises, no hidden arrangements, and no attempt to convince me to stay. She simply stood, extended her hand, and said, "Go build something remarkable, Claire. I hope one day our paths cross again under different circumstances." I shook her hand, knowing it was the most difficult goodbye I had ever experienced. 3 weeks later, I arrived in Seattle to begin my new position as Chief Strategy Officer for a rapidly growing technology company. Everything was unfamiliar. The skyline was different, the weather carried the constant scent of rain, and instead of looking out at Manhattan, my office overlooked Elliott Bay. During the first few months, I worked harder than I ever had before. Every major decision rested on my shoulders. Every success or failure belonged to me alone. There were evenings when I stayed in the office until nearly 9 o'clock reviewing expansion plans, remembering how Evelyn had taught me that leadership meant serving the people depending on you rather than protecting your own reputation. Without realizing it, I had begun leading exactly the way she had once led me. My team noticed it before I did. They told me I listened before making decisions. They said I challenged ideas without discouraging people. They thanked me for remembering birthdays, family milestones, and small victories that others overlooked. Every compliment reminded me where those habits had originated. I never copied Evelyn's words, but I carried her example into every conference room I entered. Months gradually became a year. Then another. Our company doubled its revenue, opened offices across the West Coast, and earned recognition as one of the fastest-growing firms in the country. I was invited to leadership conferences, interviewed by business publications, and eventually promoted to Chief Executive Officer after our founder retired unexpectedly. The announcement appeared in financial news across the country, yet the accomplishment felt strangely incomplete. That evening, after the celebration dinner ended, I returned alone to my office. Among the congratulatory messages waiting in my inbox was one email that immediately caught my attention. The sender simply read, "Evelyn Sterling." My hands actually trembled as I opened it. The message contained only 3 sentences. "Congratulations, Claire. I always believed you would reach this moment. I am proud that the world can finally see what I recognized years ago." I read those words again and again until the office lights automatically dimmed around me. She had kept her promise. She had never interfered with my journey, never used her influence to shape my future, and never allowed personal feelings to overshadow my independence. Now, for the first time since I had walked out of Sterling Global, we no longer stood on opposite sides of an unequal relationship. We were 2 women leading our own companies, carrying our own responsibilities, and meeting the world as equals. Only then did I begin to wonder whether the story we had both refused to write years earlier had finally reached the page where it could truly begin. 2 weeks after receiving Evelyn's email, another message appeared in my calendar that I almost ignored. It was an invitation to speak at the National Leadership Summit in Chicago, an annual conference where executives from across the country gathered to discuss innovation, ethics, and the future of business. My keynote address was scheduled for Friday morning. As I reviewed the event agenda the night before my flight, one familiar name immediately caught my attention. Evelyn Sterling would be delivering the closing presentation that same afternoon. For several minutes I simply stared at the screen. After 2 years of carefully respecting the distance that had allowed both of us to grow, fate had quietly arranged another meeting. Chicago welcomed us with crisp spring air and a skyline glowing beneath clear blue skies. The conference hotel overlooked the Chicago River, and the lobby buzzed with conversations between founders, investors, and executives exchanging ideas. When I stepped onto the stage that morning, I focused entirely on the audience. I spoke about rebuilding confidence after failure, creating workplaces built on trust instead of fear, and measuring leadership by the number of people who succeed after they leave your team. As I shared those lessons, I realized how deeply Evelyn's influence had shaped my own philosophy without ever diminishing my individuality. The audience responded with a standing ovation, but the compliment that mattered most came later that afternoon. After the final session ended, I walked into the reception hall where hundreds of guests were gathering. Across the room, I saw her. Evelyn looked almost exactly as I remembered, elegant without trying to impress anyone, confident without demanding attention. She noticed me at nearly the same moment. For a brief second, the noise around us seemed to disappear. Then we both smiled. This time there was no executive office separating us, no organizational chart defining our roles, and no ethical boundary forcing either of us to pretend our feelings did not exist. We were simply 2 women who had spent years becoming the people we were meant to become. Evelyn crossed the room first. "Chief Executive Officer Bennett," she said with a warm smile. I laughed softly. Chief Executive Officer Sterling. It has been a while. She nodded. Too long. The conversation that followed felt surprisingly effortless. We spoke about our companies, our teams, the challenges of leadership, and the lessons we had learned while apart. There was no awkwardness because neither of us carried unfinished business anymore. We had each built lives defined by our own choices rather than by one another's influence. After nearly an hour, the reception gradually emptied as guests headed toward evening events. Evelyn glanced toward the windows overlooking the river before looking back at me. There is something I have wanted to ask for 2 years, she said carefully. Now that we stand here as equals, with no professional authority between us, would you allow me to take you to dinner? I smiled before she had even finished speaking. The answer came with a sense of peace rather than excitement because it no longer felt forbidden. It simply felt right. I would like that very much. She offered her arm with quiet respect rather than assumption, allowing me to choose. I stepped beside her, and together we walked out of the conference hall into the cool Chicago evening. For the first time since we had met, neither of us was walking toward a boardroom, a negotiation, or another impossible decision. We were simply walking toward an ordinary dinner, beginning a relationship that finally rested on the one foundation both of us had waited patiently to earn together: complete equality. 1 year later, I stood once again before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, but this time I was there as an invited partner rather than an employee. My company and Sterling Global had spent months developing a joint initiative to mentor women entering executive leadership, creating scholarships, internships, and professional coaching for talented young professionals who only needed someone willing to believe in them. As I watched the first group of participants arrive, I thought about the frightened woman who had once walked into this building carrying nothing except uncertainty. She could never have imagined that one day she would return not because she needed someone to rescue her confidence, but because she had finally learned how to inspire confidence in others. Evelyn joined me beside the window, her hand resting comfortably near mine without rushing the quiet moment we shared. Our relationship had grown slowly over the past year, built through long conversations, weekend visits between Seattle and New York, countless flights, and an unwavering commitment to protecting each other's independence. We never tried to become the center of one another's lives. Instead, we became trusted companions who celebrated individual success while building something meaningful together. That balance made every shared moment feel genuine. During the opening ceremony, one of the scholarship recipients asked a question that neither of us expected. She smiled nervously before saying, "How do you know when you are making the right decision if it is also the hardest one?" The room became silent. Evelyn looked toward me, inviting me to answer first. I smiled because I finally understood the lesson life had taken years to teach me. The hardest decision is not always the wrong one, I said. Sometimes the right path asks you to become the person you need to be before it gives you the life you hope for. If someone truly cares about your future, they will never ask you to sacrifice your integrity in order to stay close to them. Evelyn nodded before adding softly, "Real leadership and real love have something important in common. Neither one is built on control. Both are built on respect, trust, and the freedom to help another person become their best self." I glanced toward her as those words settled over the audience. They were simple, but they perfectly described everything we had lived through together. After the event ended, we walked outside into the cool evening air. The streets of Manhattan were alive with familiar energy, yet everything felt different from the afternoon when I had once carried a resignation letter through these same doors believing I was walking away forever. Evelyn gently reached for my hand, and this time there was no hesitation because nothing about our relationship required secrecy or compromise. We had waited until the timing honored both our hearts and our principles. Looking back now, I realize my accidental confession never ruined my life. It revealed the truth that both of us had been protecting for all the right reasons. Love did not begin the day I admitted my feelings. It began years earlier through kindness, respect, and quiet acts of encouragement that neither of us fully understood at the time. What changed was not the feeling itself. What changed was that we became strong enough to meet each other as equals. And if there is one lesson my journey has taught me, it is this. The greatest love stories are not about choosing another person over your dreams. They are about becoming the person your dreams were preparing you to be, so that when love finally arrives, you can welcome it with confidence, dignity, and a heart that is truly free.